Thursday nights, the Sunshine Wash on Vine Street belonged almost entirely to Tessa Vaughn, and she liked it that way. She came in a little after 9, after the dinner rush had died down at the diner where she worked and after she picked up Owen and Lily from her neighbor Pam's apartment downstairs. By then the laundromat was nearly empty. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, half of them flickering in that way nobody had bothered to fix in years, and the row of dryers along the back wall turned slow and warm, tumbling other people's forgotten socks. Tessa would push the door open with her hip, a laundry basket balanced on one arm and a sleeping 4-year-old draped over the other, and the bell above the door would give its tired little jingle, and for a few hours the place was hers. She didn't come Thursday nights because she loved it. She came because the machines cost $1 less per load after 9, and because the apartment over the hardware store didn't have a washer, and because she'd learned that if she did the laundry during the day, on the weekend, when the place was full of families and teenagers and a man who always wanted to talk politics, somebody would eventually look at the state of her kids' clothes, the patched knees, the stains she couldn't get out, the coats a size too small, and they'd get that look. The soft, pitying look. Tessa would rather do laundry at 9 on a Thursday in an empty room than ever see that look again. This was Coldwater, Ohio, a town of maybe 4,000 people, most of them connected to the plastics plant out on Route 33 or the hospital 2 towns over. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your business whether you wanted them to or not, and Tessa had spent the last year and a half working very hard to make sure that nobody knew hers. Owen, who was 7, took his job seriously. He'd drag the folding table closer to the window and set out his homework, and he'd keep an eye on the dryers, calling out the numbers when a cycle finished. 41's done, Mom, he'd say, like a little man, and Tessa would smile and say thank you, sweetheart, and the two of them would fold towels together while Lily slept in the plastic chair with Tessa's coat over her like a blanket. There was a routine to it. Quarters first. Tessa kept them in an old peanut butter jar, and every Thursday she'd count them out at the kitchen table before they left, stacking them in little towers of 4, and she always counted twice. Because being $1 short at the laundromat meant a load of wet clothes she'd have to wring out by hand in the apartment sink and hang over the radiator, and that meant her uniform might still be damp in the morning. And a damp uniform was the kind of small humiliation that could undo her on a bad day. She had a lot of bad days that winter. She just didn't let anyone see them. What nobody at the Sunshine Wash knew, what nobody in Coldwater really knew, except Pam and the man at the bank, was about the envelope. Tessa kept it in the side pocket of her purse, soft and worn now from being taken out and put back so many times. It was a plain white envelope, the cheap kind that came in a box of 100, and across the front, in handwriting she would have known anywhere, it said for the rainy day, Tess. The handwriting was Danny's. Danny had been her husband. He died 19 months ago, on a Tuesday in June, when a load shifted off a forklift at the warehouse where he'd worked the overnight shift. He was 36. They told her it had been quick, that he hadn't suffered, and she'd nodded and signed the papers and gone home to a 4-year-old and a 5-year-old who didn't understand why Daddy wasn't coming back, and she'd held it together because there was no other option available to her. The envelope had been in his sock drawer. She found it 3 weeks after the funeral. Inside was $140 in 20s and a folded receipt from a hardware store, and she understood, holding it, that Danny had been saving in secret, a little at a time, the way he did everything, quietly, without fanfare, so that someday he could surprise her. For the rainy day. He used to say that, whenever things got tight, and they were always a little tight, he'd grin and say, "We'll be all right, Tess. I'm putting something away for the rainy day." She had never spent it. Even now, when there were plenty of rainy days, when the electric bill was past due and the rent was a constant low-grade panic in the back of her throat, she couldn't bring herself to break that $140. It felt like the last thing of his she had that was still whole. To spend it would be to admit he was really gone, and that the rainy day had come, and that she was facing it alone. So on Thursday night she'd sometimes take the envelope out and just look at it. Owen would be doing his math, Lily would be sleeping, the dryers would be turning, and Tessa would hold the envelope in both hands and run her thumb over Danny's handwriting and let herself feel it for exactly as long as a dryer cycle lasted. 45 minutes, then she'd put it away, wipe her face if she needed to, and go back to folding. She never cried where the kids could see. That was a rule. The man at the back of the laundromat had been coming on Thursdays for about 2 months before Tessa really noticed him. His name was Roy Dempsey, though she didn't know that yet. He was somewhere in his 70s, a big quiet man with a face like a worn-out catcher's mitt, and he always wore the same gray work jacket and the same ball cap from a feed store that had closed before Tessa was born. He'd do one load, just one, always whites, and he'd sit in the corner with a paperback western that he never seemed to make any progress in, and he'd nod at her when she came in, and that was about the extent of it. She figured him for a widower. Men his age who came to do a single load of laundry by themselves on a Thursday night usually were. He had that settled loneliness about him, the kind that didn't ask for anything. She appreciated that. He left her alone and she left him alone, and the two of them shared that flickering room in a comfortable, undemanding silence, week after week. What Tessa didn't know was that Roy noticed everything. He noticed the peanut butter jar of quarters in the careful way she counted them. He noticed that the little girl's coat had a broken zipper, held together with a safety pin, and that the boy's sneakers had a hole worn through the toe of the left one, and that the mother herself wore the same two sweaters in rotation, both of them pilled and thin at the elbows. He noticed she never bought anything from the vending machine, even when the kids looked at it, and that once, when the boy asked for a quarter for the gumball machine, she told him gently that they didn't have a spare quarter tonight, buddy, maybe next week, and that the boy had said okay, Mom, in a way that no 7-year-old should have to say it, like he already understood about money, like he'd already learned to want less. Roy noticed the envelope too. He couldn't read what was on it, but he saw the way she handled it, the careful reverence of it, the way she'd sit with it and go still and then quietly put it away and square her shoulders before turning back to her children. He buried his own wife 11 years ago. He knew what grief looked like when it had learned to wear a brave face. He recognized it the way you recognize your own reflection. For 2 months, Roy Dempsey watched a young woman keep her family together with quarters and willpower, and he didn't say a word, because he was a man who'd never known what to say, and because he understood that pride was sometimes the only thing a person had left, and you didn't take that from them. But it ate at him. He'd go home to his empty house out on County Road 9 and he'd sit at the kitchen table where his Margaret used to do the crossword, and he'd think about that boy's worn-out sneaker, and he couldn't make his peace with it. The thing that finally broke him loose happened on a Thursday in early February, on one of the coldest nights of the year. It had started snowing around 8, and by the time Tessa got the kids to the laundromat the wind was driving it sideways down Vine Street. Lily had a cough she couldn't shake, a wet rattling thing that had kept them both up the last 2 nights, and Tessa had spent her tit money that afternoon on children's cough medicine and a humidifier from the dollar store, which meant the quarter jar was lighter than usual. She'd counted it 3 times at the kitchen table and come up with enough for 2 loads instead of 3, which meant the comforter, the kids' comforter, the one Lily had thrown up on the night before, would have to wait until next week. She told herself it was fine. She'd spot clean it in the sink. It was fine. But she was tired, bone tired, the kind of tired that sat behind your eyes, and when she lifted the basket out of the trunk in the parking lot the bottom gave out. It was an old basket, cracked along one side, and the clean dirty laundry, the sorted and ready laundry, spilled out into the slush and the snow. Lily's pink shirt. Owen's school pants. A pair of Tessa's work socks. All of it in the wet gray muck of the parking lot, and Tessa stood there in the wind with the broken basket in her hands and felt something inside her start to give way. She didn't cry. The rule held, even then, even with no one watching. She just crouched down in the snow and started picking the clothes up one piece at a time, shaking the slush off them, and she felt very far away from herself, like she was watching some other woman do this, some woman who had run completely out of road. That was when Roy Dempsey's old pickup pulled into the lot, headlights sweeping across her. He didn't make a fuss. That wasn't his way. He climbed down out of the truck, set his ball cap a little lower against the wind, and crouched down beside her without a word and started gathering up the clothes that had landed near him. Tessa was so startled she almost dropped what she was holding. For a moment neither of them spoke. They just picked laundry out of the snow together, 2 strangers in a parking lot, and the wind howled down off the lake and the snow kept coming. Bottom went out, Roy finally said. It wasn't a question. It's an old basket, Tessa said. Her voice came out thinner than she meant it to. Roy nodded slowly, like this was a thing he understood completely. He stacked the clothes he'd gathered back into the broken basket, careful, like they mattered. Then he stood, and his knees cracked, and he held the door of the laundromat open while Tessa carried Lily in the salvaged laundry inside out of the wind. Owen looked up from his homework with big worried eyes, and Tessa gave him the smile, the everything's fine smile, and the boy went back to his fractions. She thought that would be the end of it. A kindness in a parking lot. People did that sometimes, even in a town that had mostly forgotten her. But Roy didn't go back to his corner. He stood for a moment by the door, turning his cap in his hands, and Tessa could see he wanted to say something and didn't have the words for it. She'd seen that look on Danny 100 times. Big quiet men, full of things they didn't know how to say. "Ma'am," Roy said at last. "My machine just finished. You're welcome to it if you've got more to wash." No sense waiting on the others. And Tessa understood that he was offering her his paid-for machine, that he'd seen her come up short, though she couldn't think how, and her face went hot. "Oh, no, thank you, but we're fine. We've got plenty." Roy nodded again, accepting the lie the way a gentleman does, and put his cap back on, and went to fold his single load of whites. And Tessa got her 2 loads going and folded what she could and told herself again that everything was fine. She didn't see what Roy did next, because she was bent over the folding table with her back to him. She didn't see him go to the bank of dryers, didn't see him pause at the one where she'd set her purse on top while she worked, didn't see him slip something into the side pocket where the worn white envelope lived. He was quick about it. He'd thought it through on the drive over, the way he thought through everything, slow and careful, and only once he was sure. Then he gathered his laundry and his unread Western, and he tipped his cap to Owen, who solemnly tipped an imaginary cap back, and Roy Dempsey walked out into the snow and drove home to his empty house on County Road 9. It was nearly 11 when Tessa finished. The kids were both asleep by then, Owen with his head down on his folded arms over the math worksheet, Lily curled in the plastic chair. Tessa loaded the warm, clean laundry back into the broken basket, holding the cracked side together with her hand, and she lifted her purse off the dryer, and that was when she felt it. Something in the side pocket. Something in the side pocket. Something that hadn't been there before. She thought, for one wild second, that she'd lost the envelope and found it again. But when she pulled the pocket open, there were 2 envelopes. Hers, soft and worn, for the rainy day, Tess. And another one, newer, the flap tucked rather than sealed. On the front, in blocky capital letters from a man unused to writing notes, it said, "For the boys' shows. And what varies their ways." Tessa's hands were not quite steady when she opened it. Inside were $300 in 20s and 10s and a second slip of paper, folded once. She unfolded it under the flickering light, and for a long moment she couldn't make sense of the words, and then she could, and then she had to sit down in the plastic chair beside her sleeping daughter because her legs wouldn't hold her. The note said, "I lost my wife some years back, so I know the look. You're doing right by those kids, and somebody ought to tell you so. This isn't charity, it's just one Coldwater family helping another, the way it used to be. Don't go looking for me to thank me. A friend." And under that, almost as an afterthought, the same blocky hand had added, "Get the little one to a doctor for that cough." Tessa Vaughn, who had not cried in front of anyone in 19 months, who had buried a husband and faced down eviction notices and counted quarters in a peanut butter jar with dry eyes, sat in a flickering laundromat at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night and finally broke. Not loud. She never was loud. But the tears came and they didn't stop, and she pressed the note to her mouth and let herself shake, and the dryers turned, and the snow fell, and across the room the bell over the door was still. She didn't know who he was. She had her suspicions, there was only one person it could be. But he'd asked her not to come looking, and she would honor that, the way you honor a thing a quiet man does quietly. But she understood, sitting there, that something had shifted. For 19 months she had been carrying the weight of her family entirely alone, refusing every sock-pitying look, refusing every casserole and every offer, because accepting help meant admitting she couldn't do it on her own, and admitting that felt like failing Danny, like failing the kids, like failing some idea of herself she'd been clutching like the last whole thing she owned. But this hadn't felt like pity, the note was right about that. This isn't charity. It hadn't been handed to her with a look, it had been slipped into her purse by a man who didn't even want to be thanked. A man who'd lost someone too and knew the particular shape of this particular loneliness, and who had decided, out of nothing but plain human decency, that one Coldwater family ought to help another. There was no shame in it. There was only the astonishing fact of it, that in the middle of the worst winter of her life, a stranger had looked at her and not looked away. Owen stirred at the table. "Mom," he mumbled, "are you crying?" And here was the thing, here was the moment Tessa would think about for years afterward. For 19 months her answer would have been no, "Sweetheart, I'm fine, just tired." The rule. Never let them see. But she looked at her son, his hair sticking up on one side, his worn-out sneaker with the hole in the toe, his serious little face that had learned to want less, and she thought about the man in the gray jacket, and she did something different. "Yeah, buddy," she said. "I am, but they're good tears, come here." And she pulled him into her lap, and Lily woke up and climbed in too, and the 3 of them sat together in that plastic chair in the empty laundromat, and Tessa told them, in the simple words you use with children, that someone had been very kind to them tonight, that sometimes when things were hard, somebody you didn't even know might help, just because that's what good people did. That they weren't as alone as it sometimes felt. "Was it the quiet man?" Owen asked. "The one with the hat," he waved at me. Tessa smiled and didn't answer because she'd been asked not to. But she pulled her son a little closer. The next part Tessa would tell people about for the rest of her life, when she was old, when the kids were grown, on the kind of nights when families tell the stories that made them who they are. Because the $300 was a mercy, it got Lily to a doctor that Saturday, where a kind nurse practitioner diagnosed bronchitis and sent them home with a prescription and a stuffed bear from a basket by the door. It bought Owen a pair of sneakers that actually fit, the light-up kind he'd wanted, and the look on his face in the shoe store was a thing she'd keep forever. It covered the gap on the electric bill so the light stayed on through February. The money mattered. Of course it mattered. But that wasn't the part that changed her. The part that changed her was the permission. The note had given her permission to stop pretending, just a little. To let her son see her cry good tears. To imagine that maybe carrying everything alone wasn't the only way to honor the man she'd lost. That maybe Danny, who'd saved quarters in secret so he could surprise her, would have wanted her to be surprised by kindness, to let it in, to let it count. She still kept his envelope. For the rainy day Tess. She kept it her whole life and never spent it. It's framed now, in the home Tessa eventually made, somewhere her grandchildren can see it. But after that February she stopped treating it like the last whole thing she had, because she'd learned something the quiet man taught her without ever saying a word. The rainy day comes for everybody. And the thing that gets you through it isn't the money you've squirreled away. It's the people who crouch down beside you in the parking lot and pick your laundry out of the snow. Tessa did eventually find out who he was. It wasn't hard in a town like Coldwater. Roy Dempsey, 74, widower, retired from the plastics plant, lived alone out on County Road 9. She never confronted him with it. He'd asked her not to, and she respected that. But that spring she started bringing him things. A loaf of banana bread, left on his porch without a note. A casserole at Christmas. Owen drew him pictures, which Tessa would slide under the windshield wiper of the old pickup at the laundromat, and Roy never said a word about any of it, just tipped his cap a little deeper each Thursday. And once, only once, when Lily ran up and hugged him around the leg before Tessa could stop her, Tessa saw that big worn-out man have to turn his face away and look out the window for a while. He'd been so alone, was the thing. That was what Tessa came to understand. She'd thought he was helping her, and he had been. But she'd also been helping him, just by letting him. By giving an old man with an empty house something to care about on a Thursday night, the kindness ran both directions, the way it always does, if you let it. The Sunshine Wash on Vine Street is still there. Tessa's situation got better, slowly, the way real life gets better, not all at once, not like a miracle, but through 100 small Thursdays. She got promoted to manager at the diner. She moved into a real house with a washer and dryer of her own, but for years, even after she didn't have to anymore, she kept coming to that laundromat on Thursday nights with a load she didn't really need to wash, because Roy was there, and because some appointment you keep for reasons that have nothing to do with laundry. When Roy passed, 6 years later, Tessa was the one who found him. She'd gotten worried when he missed 2 Thursdays in a row. She was the one who arranged the service, and she stood up in the little church on Maple Street, in front of the handful of people who'd known him, and she told them the story. The broken basket. The note. This isn't charity, it's just one Coldwater family helping another. By the end of it there wasn't a dry eye in the place, and a few people who'd lived in that town their whole lives admitted they'd never really known Roy Dempsey at all, never known what kind of man he'd been, because he'd been the kind who did his good in the dark and never told a soul. Owen, who was a teenager by then, gave the second eulogy. He talked about a pair of light-up sneakers and a man who waved at a kid doing his fractions in a laundromat, and at the end he said the thing that his mother had told him that snowy night when he was 7 years old, the thing that had become a kind of law in their family. Sometimes when things are hard, somebody you don't even know might help, just because that's what good people do. And then he added something of his own, something he'd decided about how he wanted to live. He said he planned to spend his life being the somebody. There are people in Coldwater, Ohio, to this day, who will tell you they once got an envelope they couldn't explain. A few 20s tucked into a coat pocket. A grocery bill quietly paid at the register by someone already gone out the door. They never figured out where it came from, only that it always seemed to come on the hardest weeks, when they told no one how bad things had gotten. They don't know it was a single mother and her grown children, keeping a promise to an old man, doing his good the way he'd done it, in the dark, without a word, asking nobody to thank them. But that's the way it's supposed to work. The quiet man knew that. A kindness given freely doesn't stop with the person who receives it. It goes looking for the next person crouched down in the snow, And somewhere out there, on a cold Thursday night, somebody is reaching into a coat pocket they thought was empty, and finding out they were never quite as alone as they believed. I've thought about that broken laundry basket more times than I can count, and every time I land on the same quiet truth: nothing about Tessa's night happened by accident. The envelope didn't fall out of the sky. It showed up because a man named Roy Dempsey spent 2 months actually looking at a tired young mother instead of past her, and then because he chose to do something with what he saw. That's the part I never want anyone to miss. Kindness almost never arrives as luck. It arrives as a decision somebody made on your behalf when they didn't have to. What gets me most is how much of this came down to plain character, the unglamorous kind. Roy wasn't rich. He did 1 load of whites and read the same Western for 2 months, but he had a sense of right and wrong that wouldn't let him sleep easy knowing a 7-year-old was wearing a sneaker with a hole in the toe. He could have told himself it wasn't his business, the way most of us do, and gone home. Instead, he let it bother him, and then he acted on it without asking for a thing in return. That's what decency actually looks like up close. It's quiet, it's a little awkward, and it costs you something. But decency alone wasn't enough, and I think that's worth sitting with. Roy was also smart about it. He understood that handing Tessa cash to her face would have shut her down on the spot, because her pride was the last whole thing she had. So he read the situation, slipped the envelope into her purse, and signed it, "A friend." That was wisdom, the everyday kind, knowing not just what's right but how to do it in a way the other person can actually receive. Good intentions clumsily delivered would have wounded her. He saw that, and he was careful. And then there's Tessa herself, who taught me the most. For 19 months that woman counted quarters in a peanut butter jar and refused to crack, and people might call that stubbornness, but I call it backbone. She kept her kids fed and clothed and loved when she had every excuse to fall apart. The envelope didn't rescue her. She'd already been carrying the whole weight on her own 2 shoulders. What it gave her was permission to stop carrying it alone, and it took real courage for her to accept that, to let Owen see her cry good tears, to let kindness count instead of waving it off. That's the chain, the way I see it. A man's conscience, his good judgment, and a mother's sheer endurance all met in a flickering laundromat on the coldest night of the year, and a family got saved. And then, years later, Tessa and her grown children went out and did the same thing for strangers they'll never meet. None of it was magic. It was just 3 ordinary kinds of strength, passed hand to hand, refusing to stop.